It's crazy to think something as small as a couple grains of salt can kill you.
Yeah.
But that's fentanyl for you.
It is.
It's the #1 cause of overdose deaths in the U.S. now.
Yeah.
And the journey that it takes from, like, clandestine labs to our streets is both complex and terrifying.
It is.
So today, we're going to deep dive into this intricate world of fentanyl smuggling.
Okay.
Where it comes from.
Sounds good.
How it gets here.
All right.
And why it's such a devastating force.
Well, what's so fascinating and also just truly frightening is how this network has adapted over time.
Yeah.
It's like a hydra.
Oh, wow.
You cut off one head and 2 more grow back.
Okay, so let's unpack this hydra, starting with its origins.
Okay.
We know fentanyl is incredibly potent.
Right.
Up to 50 times stronger than heroin.
Wow.
And it's often disguised in counterfeit pills.
Yes.
Making it even more dangerous.
For sure.
But where does it all begin?
Well, in the early days of the fentanyl crisis, all roads led to China. They were the primary source, producing and exporting both fentanyl itself and the precursor chemicals needed to make it.
So like a recipe for disaster. They were sending out the ingredients for this incredibly dangerous drug.
Exactly.
Wow.
It was a global distribution network.
Yeah.
And while China did eventually outlaw fentanyl production in 2019, it didn't completely stop the flow.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it just shifted the landscape.
It's almost like a game of whack-a-mole, right?
Yes.
You shut it down in one place, and it pops up somewhere else.
Precisely. And that shift led to the rise of new smuggling routes.
Okay.
Primarily through Canada and Mexico.
I'm curious about the Canada route.
Yeah.
I understand it was particularly successful for a while.
Yes.
Due to looser regulations. So fentanyl or its precursors were shipped there from China.
Right.
Making it harder to track.
Yeah, much harder to track.
And then smuggled into the U.S.
You gotta imagine trying to track a package that's been relabeled and rerouted multiple times.
Oh, my shit.
It becomes a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Canada has since tightened its controls.
Okay.
But it highlights the lengths these traffickers go to exploit any vulnerability they can find.
Wow.
But let's shift our focus to the main pipeline now.
Okay.
China to Mexico. This is where the real power players come in the Mexican drug cartels.
We're talking about the Sinaloa and Jalisco new generation cartels, right?
Yes.
These organizations have become deeply involved in both producing and trafficking fentanyl, essentially creating a deadly business partnership with Chinese suppliers to get those precursor chemicals.
Yes.
And setting up sophisticated labs south of the border.
It's a prime example of how these criminal organizations adapt and evolve.
Yeah.
They saw a way to maximize profits, and they capitalized on it ruthlessly.
Wow.
And once that fentanyl is manufactured in Mexico, the next challenge is getting it across the U.S. border.
Which, as we know, is a massive undertaking in itself.
Absolutely.
We're talking tunnels, hidden compartments in vehicles, drones, even exploiting weaknesses at legal ports of entry.
Right.
It's a constant cat and mouse game with billions of dollars at stake.
Exactly. The cartels have the resources and the motivation to be incredibly creative, constantly developing new methods to evade detection.
But it's not just the sheer volume of fentanyl that's so alarming, right?
Right.
It's the fact that it's often mixed with other drugs without the user's knowledge.
Yes.
Someone thinking they're taking a dose of heroin or cocaine could unknowingly be ingesting a lethal amount of fentanyl.
That's right. Think of it like playing Russian roulette with your life.
Oh, gosh.
You just never know what you're really getting.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of counterfeit pills, a particularly insidious tactic.
Yeah.
People seeking pain relief or maybe experimenting with recreational drugs end up with a pill laced with fentanyl because it's virtually indistinguishable from a legitimate prescription.
It's a terrifying level of deception that preys on the vulnerable, those who might already be struggling with addiction or desperate for pain relief.
Right.
And this brings us to a crucial question.
Okay.
Why is fentanyl so incredibly dangerous? We know it's potent.
Yeah.
But what makes it so deadly, even in tiny amounts?
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, and it's designed to bind to opioid receptors in the brain, which are responsible for controlling pain and pleasure. But fentanyl binds to these receptors much more strongly than other opioids. Like heroin or morphine.
So it's like a key that fits the lock perfectly, but it turns with overwhelming force.
That's a great analogy.
Wow.
This powerful binding triggers a cascade of effects: intense euphoria, sedation, respiratory depression, and in high enough doses, it can completely shut down your breathing, leading to death.
And that's the truly terrifying part, right? The tiniest amount can be fatal. It's not like other drugs where you might have some room for error. With fentanyl, there's often no second chance.
That's why this isn't just a border security issue or a problem for law enforcement. This is a public health crisis that demands a multifaceted approach. We need to be talking about prevention, education, treatment, harm reduction, all of it.
Speaking of education, you mentioned naloxone earlier. I think it's important we take a moment to explain what that is and how it can literally be a lifesaver in these situations.
Absolutely. Naloxone, also known by the brand name Narcan, is a medication that can rapidly reverse an opioid overdose. It works by blocking the effects of opioids on the brain, essentially knocking the fentanyl off those receptors we were talking about.
So it's like an emergency brake for an overdose.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that naloxone is now widely available without a prescription in many places. You can find it at pharmacies, community health centers, even some convenience stores.
That's incredible. It really highlights how this crisis has prompted a shift in our approach to opioid overdoses. It's no longer just about punishment or stigma, it's about saving lives.
And that's a crucial point. The more we talk about this openly and honestly, the less stigma there will be, and the more likely people are to seek help if they need it, or know how to respond if they encounter an overdose.
And it's so important to remember that fentanyl doesn't discriminate. It can impact anyone, regardless of age, background, or socioeconomic status. I read a heartbreaking story recently about a young college student who bought what he thought was a prescription painkiller online, only to discover it was laced with fentanyl. He didn't stand a chance.
It's a tragedy we see play out far too often, and it speaks to the need for greater awareness and education, especially among young people. We need to be having these conversations, making sure they understand the risks and equipping them with the knowledge to make safe choices.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And in this case, it can literally be the difference between life and death.
Mm-hmm.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the efforts being made to combat this crisis. We've got increased border security, international pressure on China to keep cracking down public health campaigns, raising awareness, and promoting access to naloxone.
And don't forget about the legislative efforts to control synthetic opioids. There are people working tirelessly on this issue from multiple angles.
It's a massive undertaking, and I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of the most promising strategies? Where do we need to focus our efforts to make the biggest impact?
Well, one area that's showing real promise is harm reduction. This approach focuses on reducing the negative consequences of drug use without necessarily requiring abstinence. It's about meeting people where they're at and providing them with the tools and support they need to stay safe.
So things like needle exchange programs, safe consumption sites, access to testing kits so people can check their drugs for fentanyl.
Exactly. These strategies have been proven to save lives and reduce the spread of infectious diseases. And importantly, they can also be a gateway to treatment and recovery for those who are ready.
It's about recognizing that addiction is a complex issue, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We need a range of options to address the diverse needs of individuals and communities.
Precisely. And another area where we're seeing progress is in the development of new medications to treat opioid use disorder. Medications like methadone and buprenorphine can help reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms, making it easier for people to manage their addiction and rebuild their lives.
So it's like providing a lifeline, a bridge to stability, while people work on the underlying issues that might have contributed to their addiction.
Exactly. And alongside medication, we need to invest in comprehensive support services, counseling therapy, job training, housing assistance, all the things that can help people create a life worth living free from addiction.
It's about recognizing that addiction is not a moral failing. It's a health issue, and it requires a compassionate and holistic approach to treatment.
Absolutely. We need to shift the narrative away from blame and shame and towards understanding and support.
We've talked a lot about the supply side of this crisis, the smuggling routes, the cartels, the efforts to interdict the flow of fentanyl. But I think it's crucial that we also delve into the demand side. What are the underlying factors that have led so many people to turn to these dangerous substances in the first place?
That's a critical question, and it's one we'll need to unpack carefully. Because to truly address the fentanyl crisis, we need to understand not just the how, but the why.
Right. It's like treating a symptom without addressing the underlying disease. And one of the key factors we need to examine is the role of the pharmaceutical industry, particularly in the overprescription of opioid painkillers.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's where a lot of this story begins.
Okay, so let's talk about the role of the pharmaceutical industry in this crisis.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue, but I think it's important to understand how we went from prescription painkillers to a full-blown fentanyl epidemic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a story that really begins in the 1990s with a push for more aggressive pain management. Pharmaceutical companies began marketing opioid painkillers like OxyContin as safe and effective for long-term use, kind of downplaying the risks of addiction.
And doctors were buying into this message. I mean, they're the ones prescribing these medications.
Unfortunately, yes. Many doctors were reassured by these marketing campaigns and began prescribing opioids more liberally. Patients, of course, were also demanding relief from pain, and opioids, at least initially, provided that relief.
So you had this perfect storm brewing, aggressive marketing, increased prescribing, and patients seeking pain relief. It seems almost inevitable that things would go wrong.
It was a recipe for disaster. It turned out that opioids were far more addictive than initially advertised, and many people who started taking these pills for legitimate pain ended up developing a dependence.
And once that dependence takes hold, it's a slippery slope, right? Because as tolerance builds, people need higher doses to achieve the same effect. They might start seeking out illicit sources to get their fix.
Exactly. And that's where fentanyl comes in. It's cheap to produce, incredibly potent, and easy to mix with other drugs. So as the demand for opioids continued to rise, fentanyl flooded the market, offering a dangerous and readily available alternative.
It's tragic. A system designed to alleviate suffering ended up creating a whole new wave of suffering.
It's a heartbreaking consequence of good intentions gone awry. But it's not just about the pills themselves. There are broader societal issues that play a role in this crisis as well.
You're talking about things like poverty, lack of access to health care, mental health issues, trauma, all the factors that can make someone more vulnerable to addiction.
Precisely. These are the root causes, the underlying conditions that create a fertile ground for this epidemic to thrive.
It's like this complex web of interconnected issues, social, economic, political, all converging to create a perfect breeding ground for despair and desperation.
And that's why addressing the fentanyl crisis requires a multi-pronged approach. We need to focus on prevention, education, treatment, harm reduction, but we also need to address those underlying societal issues that make people vulnerable to addiction in the first place.
So it's not just about cracking down on smugglers or tightening border security. It's about creating a society where fewer people feel the need to turn to these dangerous substances in the first place.
Exactly. It's about investing in our communities, providing support for those struggling with addiction, and addressing those systemic inequalities that create a fertile ground for this crisis to thrive.
Wow, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. We've gone from the specifics of fentanyl smuggling routes to the broader societal forces at play, and I think it's safe to say that this is an issue with no easy answers. But what I find encouraging is that there are so many people working on this problem from different angles. Researchers, healthcare professionals, policymakers, community activists.
I agree. And while the challenges are immense, I believe there's hope. We're learning more about this crisis every day, and with that knowledge comes the power to make a difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. We've talked a lot about the things governments, organizations, and communities can do. But what about you? What can you do in your own life to be part of the solution? Maybe it's learning more about the signs of opioid overdose or carrying naloxone. Maybe it's supporting a local organization that's working on the front lines of this crisis. Or maybe it's simply having an open and honest conversation with someone you love about the dangers of fentanyl. Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to a ripple effect of change.
Yeah, it starts with awareness, with compassion, and with a commitment to making a difference.
And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own deep dive into this critical issue. Thanks for joining us.